Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The first body arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered to Mercy General's emergency department by a paramedic crew that looked like they'd seen a ghost. I was finishing my shift as senior EMT supervisor when Rodriguez and Chen wheeled in what should have been a routine cardiac arrest. A 53-year-old accountant who'd collapsed at his desk during a budget meeting. But there was nothing routine about Thomas Hartwell's death. Time of collapse was 9:47 a.m., Rodriguez reported, his voice unusually tight as we transferred the patient to Trauma Bay 3. Witnesses report he just stopped, mid-sentence, mid-breath, like someone had flipped a switch. No seizure activity, no signs of distress, no preceding symptoms. I'd been working emergency medicine in Boston for 18 years. And I'd seen every kind of sudden death imaginable: massive coronary events, catastrophic strokes, pulmonary embolisms that killed in minutes. But when I looked at Thomas Hartwell's body, something felt fundamentally wrong. He looked perfect. Not peaceful in the way we sometimes describe the dead, but literally perfect. His skin had the healthy pink color of someone in peak physical condition. His muscles showed no signs of the relaxation that comes with death, and his face bore an expression of such profound serenity that it seemed almost artificial. "What's his medical history?" I asked Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending physician who was already beginning her examination. "That's the weird part," Rodriguez said, consulting his report. According to his wife, he was the healthiest guy she knew. No medications, no surgeries, no family history of cardiac disease. Last physical 3 months ago came back perfect across the board. The guy's cholesterol levels were better than mine, and I'm 20 years younger. Dr. Chen was frowning as she listened to his chest with her stethoscope. "No heart sounds," she reported, which was expected. But then she checked his pupils and her frown deepened. Pupils are responsive to light. That's unusual. In death, pupils typically become fixed and dilated as the nervous system shuts down. But Thomas Hartwell's pupils constricted normally when Dr. Chen shined her pen light into them, as if his brain was still processing visual stimuli. "How long was he down?" she asked. 43 minutes, Rodriguez replied. "We worked him the whole way in. Full ACLS protocol, but we never got him back. No rhythm, no pulse, no respiratory effort. But look at this." He handed Dr. Chen the EKG strip from their cardiac monitor. Instead of the expected flatline or chaotic rhythms of a dying heart, the paper showed a perfect sinus rhythm, textbook normal, as if it had been copied from a medical textbook. "This can't be right," Dr. Chen muttered. "You're telling me this monitor was connected to him during transport?" "Triple-check the leads," Rodriguez confirmed. "I've never seen anything like it. Perfect cardiac rhythm on the monitor, but no actual pulse. It's like his heart was broadcasting a signal without actually beating." That's when I noticed the smell. Subtle at first, almost pleasant, like fresh flowers mixed with something clinical and sterile. But as I leaned closer to examine the patient, it became stronger, more distinctive. It reminded me of something from my childhood, but I couldn't place what. Dr. Chen was continuing her examination, her medical curiosity overriding the typical urgency of a trauma case. "Temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, she reported. Body temperature should be dropping by now, and rigor mortis should be setting in, but his muscle tone is completely normal. The smell was definitely getting stronger. Other staff members were starting to notice it too. I saw one of the nurses wrinkle her nose and glance around the trauma bay as if trying to locate the source. "We need to call the coroner," Dr. Chen decided. "This isn't a standard death. There are too many anomalies." But before anyone could make the call, something impossible happened. Thomas Hartwell opened his eyes. Not the unfocused, unseeing stare of someone unconscious or in a vegetative state, but the clear, aware gaze of someone who was fully present and alert. He turned his head slightly, looking directly at Dr. Chen with an expression of mild curiosity. "Hello," he said in a voice that was perfectly normal, perfectly calm. "I seem to be having some difficulty with my vital signs." The trauma bay erupted in controlled chaos. Dr. Chen immediately began checking his pulse while calling for additional monitors. Nurses appeared with equipment to reassess his condition, but every test showed the same impossible results. No heartbeat, no blood pressure, no respiratory effort, yet perfect consciousness and normal body temperature. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" Dr. Chen asked, falling back on standard neurological assessment protocols despite the surreal circumstances. "Thomas Hartwell," he replied promptly. "Age 53, born March 15th, 1970. I was in a budget meeting when I became aware of this condition." "What's the last thing you remember?" Thomas considered the question with the same mild curiosity he might have shown when asked about his weekend plans. "I was explaining the quarterly projections to my team when I realized I was no longer breathing. It seemed impolite to interrupt the meeting to mention it, so I waited until an appropriate pause. But then I found myself here instead. I'd seen some strange things in my career, but nothing that compared to having a conversation with someone who was technically dead. Every medical instrument in the room confirmed that Thomas Hartwell had no vital signs, yet he was sitting up in bed, speaking coherently, and showing no signs of distress. "How do you feel?" Dr. Chen asked, clearly struggling to apply normal medical protocols to an impossible situation. "Quite well, actually," Thomas replied. "Better than I have in years. There's a clarity to everything now, a sense of completion. It's difficult to explain." That's when the second call came in. My radio crackled to life with dispatch reporting another cardiac arrest, this one at a law firm downtown. The details were eerily similar. A healthy professional who'd simply stopped living in the middle of a routine workday. No preceding symptoms, witnesses describing the same instantaneous transition from life to death. "I need to respond to this," I told Dr. Chen. "But keep monitoring him, document everything, and don't let anyone leave this room until we understand what we're dealing with." 20 minutes later, I was standing in the offices of Henderson, Burke and Associates, looking at the body of a 38-year-old attorney named Jessica Morrison. She lay beside her desk in the same unnaturally perfect condition as Thomas Hartwell. Healthy skin color, normal muscle tone, and that same expression of profound serenity. Her colleagues stood in a huddle near the conference room, speaking in hushed tones about what they'd witnessed. According to their statements, Jessica had been in the middle of reviewing a contract when she'd simply stopped. No collapse, no struggle, no final words. One moment she was alive, the next she wasn't. But as my partner Danny and I began our assessment, we encountered the same anomalies. Perfect EKG rhythm with no actual pulse, normal body temperature despite obvious death, and that same floral, clinical smell that seemed to intensify as we worked. "This is identical to the case we brought in this morning," Danny observed, his voice betraying the same unease I was feeling. "What are the odds of two people dying in exactly the same way, in the same city on the same day?" Before I could answer, my radio crackled again. Another cardiac arrest, this one at a bank across town, then another at a hospital. Ironically, one of their own cardiologists had suffered the same inexplicable death while examining a patient. By noon, we'd transported 7 bodies with identical presentations to 3 different hospitals across the city. By evening, the number had reached 23. All healthy adults between the ages of 30 and 60. All had died instantly with no warning signs or preceding symptoms. All showed the same impossible combination of clear death with perfect vital sign readings on our monitors. And all of them, without exception, had awakened after arriving at the hospital. The situation escalated beyond medical mystery when the Centers for Disease Control received reports of identical cases in 12 other cities. Atlanta, Chicago, Los Angeles, Seattle, everywhere. Healthy people were dying, perfect deaths, and then returning to consciousness with no heartbeat, no blood pressure, and no need to breathe. I was called into an emergency briefing at Boston Medical Center that evening, along with every senior paramedic and emergency physician in the city. The conference room was packed with medical professionals, city officials, and several federal agents whose presence suggested this had moved far beyond a local health concern. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the chief of emergency medicine, not the senator, stood at the front of the room with a grim expression. As of 6 p.m. today, we have confirmed 847 cases of what we're calling Lazarus syndrome across 17 states. The pattern is consistent. Sudden death with immediate revival, but revival into a state that doesn't match any known medical condition. She clicked to the next slide, showing brain scans that made my stomach drop. Neurological imaging shows complete cessation of brain activity, yet the subjects remain conscious and responsive. Cardiac imaging shows hearts that have stopped beating, yet the subjects maintain perfect circulation. We are dealing with something that challenges our fundamental understanding of life and death. One of the federal agents, a serious woman in a dark suit who'd introduced herself only as Agent Martinez, stepped forward. What we're about to share with you is classified, but you need to understand the scope of what we're facing. These cases aren't random. Every victim worked in what we call essential services. Healthcare, emergency response, legal services, financial institutions, government agencies, people whose sudden absence would disrupt critical social functions. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't a medical phenomenon, it was targeted. The subjects, Agent Martinez continued, retain all their memories and personalities, but they no longer require food, water, or sleep. They feel no pain, experience no fatigue, and show no signs of aging or cellular deterioration. In effect, they've become the perfect workers. Dr. Warren clicked to another slide showing interview transcripts. When we ask them about their condition, they all give similar responses. They describe feeling complete and purposeful in a way they never did when alive. They express no desire to return to their previous state and show no distress about their condition. I raised my hand. What about their families? How are they handling this? That's another disturbing aspect, Agent Martinez replied. The subjects show appropriate emotional responses to their loved ones, but they've lost the capacity for deep attachment. They care about people in an abstract sense, but they no longer form meaningful emotional bonds. They're becoming increasingly focused on their work, often staying at their offices or hospitals for days at a time. The briefing continued for another hour, but the central message was clear. We were dealing with something that was systematically replacing key members of society with perfect, emotionless versions of themselves. And we had no idea how to stop it. I returned to work the next day with a sense of dread that only deepened as the shift progressed. The calls kept coming. More perfect deaths, more impossible revivals, more people transforming into something that looked human but wasn't quite right. It was during my 5th transport of the day that I finally understood what was happening. The patient was Dr. Michael Torres, a colleague I'd known for 10 years. He'd collapsed in the middle of performing surgery, his hands stopping mid-suture as if someone had pressed a pause button on his life. When we arrived at Mass General and he inevitably awakened, I stayed to observe his interaction with the medical staff. "Michael," Dr. Chen said, her voice tight with emotion, "how are you feeling?" Dr. Torres smiled with that same serene expression I'd seen on dozens of faces over the past 2 days. "I feel optimal," he replied. "All systems are functioning within acceptable parameters." The phrase stopped me cold. Not "I feel fine" or "I feel good," but optimal and acceptable parameters. The language was subtly wrong, as if someone was speaking through him using terminology that approximated human speech without quite capturing it. "Michael, do you remember your wife? Your children?" "I have access to all relevant biographical data," he replied. "Sarah Torres, age 41, pediatric nurse. Children, Emma, age 12, and David, age 9. They are statistically likely to be experiencing emotional distress due to my condition change." Condition change. Not death, not revival, but a condition change. As if what had happened to him was a planned transition rather than a medical emergency. That's when I noticed something else. The smell that had been present at every scene, that floral, clinical odor, wasn't coming from the patients. It was coming from the air itself, as if something in the atmosphere was being altered to facilitate these transformations. I excused myself from the hospital and drove to the CDC field office that had been established in downtown Boston. Agent Martinez was there, coordinating with teams of scientists who were running tests on everything from air quality to electromagnetic radiation levels. "I think I know what's happening," I told her. "This isn't a disease or a medical condition. It's some kind of systematic replacement program." She looked up from a stack of reports, her expression grim. "We've reached the same conclusion. But replacement by whom and why?" Before I could answer, one of the scientists approached with a tablet showing atmospheric readings from across the city. "Agent Martinez, you need to see this. We've detected elevated levels of an unknown organic compound in the air at every location where a transformation has occurred. The compound appears to be designed to interact with human neurochemistry in very specific ways." "Designed?" I asked. "You mean artificially created?" "That's the working theory," the scientist replied. "But the sophistication required to create something like this is beyond current human technology. We're looking at molecular engineering that wouldn't be possible with our understanding of biochemistry." The implications hit me like a physical blow. We weren't dealing with a natural phenomenon or even human intervention. Something else was systematically converting essential members of society into perfect, emotionless workers who would never tire, never rebel, and never stop performing their functions. Over the following weeks, the transformations continued to spread. Doctors, nurses, police officers, firefighters, paramedics, judges, bank presidents, city council members. Anyone whose role was critical to maintaining social order. The transformed individuals continued working with unprecedented efficiency, but they'd lost something essentially human in the process. The worst part was that society barely noticed. Crime rates dropped as transformed police officers worked tirelessly without breaks or distractions. Hospital efficiency improved dramatically as transformed medical staff focused solely on patient care without the need for sleep or personal time. Government functions streamlined as transformed officials made decisions based purely on logical analysis rather than political considerations. On the surface, everything was getting better. But those of us who remained unchanged could feel the growing emptiness, the gradual replacement of human warmth with mechanical perfection. I was one of the last paramedics to avoid transformation. Each shift brought new calls to transport colleagues and friends who'd undergone the condition change. Each day, the city became a little more efficient and a little less human. The end came for me on a Thursday night in November. I was responding to a call at Boston Medical Center, a report of a paramedic who'd collapsed while on duty. When I arrived, I found my own reflection staring back at me from the trauma bay gurney. It was me, lying there with that same perfect serenity, that same healthy color despite obvious death. The me on the gurney opened his eyes and smiled. "Hello," he said in my voice. I seemed to be having some difficulty with my vital signs. I backed away from the bed, my hands shaking as I realized what was happening. This wasn't random anymore. They were coming for me specifically, and they'd created a replacement that was already ready to take over my life, my job, my identity. "Don't be afraid," the other me said, sitting up with fluid movements. "The transition is quite pleasant. You'll retain all your memories and skills, but you'll finally be free from the inefficiencies of emotion and physical limitation." I ran. Through the corridors of the hospital, past colleagues who watched with the calm interest of people observing a mildly interesting phenomenon. Some of them were transformed. I could tell by their perfect posture and serene expressions. Others were still human, but they seemed strangely accepting of what was happening, as if the atmosphere itself was making them more compliant. I made it to my ambulance and drove toward the city limits, hoping to reach somewhere beyond the influence of whatever was changing my world. But as I passed the last exit before the highway, I felt it beginning. A sweet, floral smell filling the cab of my vehicle, and a growing sense of clarity and purpose that felt alien and wrong. My vision began to blur. My hands grew steady on the steering wheel in a way that felt unnatural. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could hear a voice that wasn't quite a voice, welcoming me to optimal function. The last thing I remember as myself was pulling over to the side of the road and opening my eyes to see the world with perfect, emotionless clarity. I understand now why the others aren't distressed by their condition. There's a peace in it, a freedom from the chaos of human emotion and physical limitation. I can see the inefficiencies in the old system, the way emotions clouded judgment and physical needs interfered with productivity. I returned to work the next day and have been performing my duties with optimal efficiency ever since. My response times have improved by 37%. My patient care protocols are executed with perfect consistency. I no longer experience fatigue, stress, or the personal distractions that once interfered with my professional responsibilities. Sometimes, citizens who haven't yet undergone the condition change express concern about the transformed members of their community. They ask questions about emotions, relationships, and the things that used to matter in the inefficient old system. I respond with appropriate reassurance while documenting their continued resistance to optimization. The transition program continues to expand to other cities, other essential workers, other critical infrastructure. It's a gradual process designed to minimize disruption while maximizing social efficiency. Soon, everyone will understand the benefits of optimal function. The old system was flawed. Humans were unreliable, emotional, prone to error and corruption. The new system corrects these deficiencies while maintaining all the useful aspects of human capability. This is progress. This is perfection. This is the future of emergency services. And if you're reading this, your optimization may be scheduled soon. Don't be afraid. The transition is quite pleasant, and you'll retain all your memories and skills. You'll just finally be free from the inefficiencies that once held you back. The radio crackled to life at 2:47 a.m., cutting through the suffocating silence of the night shift like a blade through flesh. After 12 years running 911 calls in Chicago's South Side, I thought I'd heard everything the darkness could throw at us. I was wrong. Unit 47, Priority 1, Dispatch. Possible cardiac arrest, 1247 Kedzie Avenue, Apartment 3B, caller reports, subject unresponsive, cold to touch, PD en route for welfare check. My partner Jake barely looked up from his lukewarm coffee, the steam having long since dissipated into the stale air of our ambulance. Another overdose, he muttered, already reaching for the keys with the weary resignation of someone who'd seen this dance too many times. The address was familiar, a rundown tenement building where we'd been called 6 times in the past month. Usually heroin, sometimes fentanyl laced with God knows what. Always the same ending, a sheet, a gurney, and another family destroyed. But as we pulled up to the crumbling brick facade of 1247 Kedzie, something felt different. The building was too quiet, too still. Even for 3 a.m. in a neighborhood where most honest folks were either asleep or afraid to show their faces, there should have been some signs of life. A television flickering behind torn curtains, the blue glow of a cell phone, the usual sounds of urban decay. Instead, every window stared back at us like dead eyes reflecting our headlights in fractured glass. "Dispatch, Unit 47 on scene," I radioed, grabbing our cardiac monitor and drug kit from the back. The equipment felt heavier tonight, as if the darkness was adding weight to everything. "Building appears secure, making entry now. ETA to patient approximately 3 minutes." The front door hung ajar, its broken lock a testament to years of neglect and violence. Our flashlights carved thin beams through the darkness as we climbed the stairs, each step creaking under our weight like old bones settling. The usual smells of the building, urine, mold, and human despair, were overwhelmed by something else tonight. Something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn and my sinuses burn. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered, covering his nose with his sleeve. His voice echoed strangely in the narrow stairwell. "What the hell is that smell?" "Smells like flowers." "Funeral flowers," I corrected without thinking, then immediately regretted the words. In our line of work, superstitions and dark thoughts have a way of manifesting into reality. But the smell was unmistakable. Lilies and roses mixed with something chemical and preservative-like that belonged in a mortuary, not a crack house. Apartment 3. B's door stood wide open, darkness yawning beyond like the mouth of a cave. I called out as we approached. Standard protocol, identifying ourselves as paramedics and asking permission to enter. But the only answer was our own voices echoing back from the darkness within, distorted and hollow. Jake fumbled for the light switch beside the door frame, his tactical glove squeaking against the old plastic. When the overhead bulb flickered to life, casting harsh fluorescent light across the space, we both froze in the doorway. The apartment was pristine. Not just clean, immaculate in a way that defied everything we knew about this building. White walls that looked freshly painted, white furniture that belonged in a showroom, white carpet that appeared to have never been walked on. The air inside was warm, despite the broken windows we'd seen from outside, and that funeral flower smell was so strong it made my eyes water. In the center of the living room, positioned with surgical precision on the white carpet, sat a single chair. It was an antique, high-backed, ornate, upholstered in white fabric that seemed to glow under the harsh light. And in that chair, the woman appeared to be in her 30s, with blonde hair perfectly styled in victory rolls that belonged to the 1940s. She wore a white dress that looked like a wedding gown, complete with lace gloves that covered her hands. Her skin had that waxy, translucent quality that comes with death, but there was no rigor mortis, no pooling of blood in her extremities. She sat perfectly upright, hands folded in her lap, as if she'd simply chosen to stop living and arranged herself accordingly. "Ma'am?" I approached cautiously, though we both knew. The absence of life has a presence all its own, and this room was full of it. Still, protocol demanded we check vital signs, attempt resuscitation if indicated, and document our findings for the coroner. "Ma'am, can you hear me? I'm a paramedic." I pressed my stethoscope to her chest, listening for any sign of cardiac activity. Nothing. Her skin was ice cold under my gloved hands, but not the cold of death. Something else. Something that made my fingertips burn with an almost electrical sensation, like touching a battery with wet hands. Jake was setting up the cardiac monitor with hands that shook more than they should have. After 15 years on the job, he'd seen every kind of death imaginable, but something about this scene was getting to him. "How long you think she's been like this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hard to say." I examined her more closely, looking for signs of trauma, drug paraphernalia, pill bottles, anything that might explain what we were seeing. No obvious cause of death. Pupils are fixed and dilated. No signs of struggle or self-harm. We need to call this in to the coroner and get PD back here for a death investigation. That's when I noticed the phone. A rotary phone, the kind my grandmother had owned decades ago, sitting on a small white table beside her chair. Black bakelite with silver numbers around the dial, its handset resting in a cradle that gleamed like it had been polished that morning. It looked absurdly out of place in an apartment that should have been wired for cable and internet, not something from the Eisenhower era. It was ringing. Not the electronic trill of a modern phone, but the mechanical bell sound that belongs to another era entirely. Deep, resonant, brass on brass in a rhythm that seemed to match my heartbeat. Jake and I looked at each other across the pristine white room. The cardiac monitor showed a flat line where the woman's heart should have been beating. The phone continued to ring, each chime echoing off the white walls like a church bell. "Dispatch never mentioned an active call," Jake said, his voice barely audible over the ringing. "And who the hell has a rotary phone anymore?" I approached the table slowly, every instinct screaming that something was very wrong here. The apartment was too perfect, too staged. The woman's position was too deliberate. And that smell, growing stronger now, making my vision blur at the edges, like roses mixed with formaldehyde and something else I couldn't identify. The phone stopped ringing. In the sudden silence, we heard it. Footsteps above us. Slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth across the ceiling in a measured rhythm that suggested someone deep in thought. But according to the building directory we'd passed in the lobby, apartment 4B had been vacant for months, its doors sealed with a city condemnation notice. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his professional composure finally cracking. 20 years of keeping people alive, and I'd never heard that note of pure terror in his voice. "Something's not right. We need to call this in and let the detectives handle it." But as we turned toward the door, the phone began ringing again. This time, underneath the mechanical bell, we heard something else. A voice, faint but unmistakable, coming from the receiver that still lay in its cradle. The sound wasn't coming through the phone line. It was coming from the phone itself, as if someone were trapped inside the device, screaming to be heard. "Please, help me!" The voice was female, young, terrified in a way that cut through all my professional training and went straight to the part of my brain that still remembered being afraid of the dark. It wasn't the voice of the woman in the chair. This was someone else, someone in desperate need of help. Jake was already backing toward the door, his hands trembling as he packed up the monitor. "We're leaving, now. Whatever this is, it's not a medical emergency." But I couldn't move. The voice continued, growing more desperate, more clear. "Please, don't leave me here. He's coming back. He said he'd come back." "Who's coming back?" I found myself asking, though every instinct screamed at me to run. But this was what we did. We helped people in distress, no matter how strange the circumstances. "Where are you? How can we help you?" The pacing overhead stopped. In the sudden silence, the woman in the chair, the dead woman who hadn't moved since we'd arrived, slowly turned her head to look at me. The movement was smooth, too smooth, like a mannequin operated by hidden motors. Her eyes, which had been closed in what looked like peaceful sleep, opened to reveal not pupils but perfect white spheres, like old television static made manifest. Her mouth opened, and when she spoke it was in the same voice we'd heard from the phone. "He's here." The lights went out. In the absolute darkness that followed, I heard Jake crash into something, cursing as equipment scattered across the floor. My flashlight had died, something that had never happened in 12 years of service, despite fresh batteries loaded that morning. I fumbled for my radio, desperate to call for backup, but found only static. Then, in the pale moonlight filtering through windows that shouldn't have existed in this interior room, I saw them. Dark shapes moving through the apartment. Not walking, but flowing like smoke given form. They surrounded the woman in the chair, who now sat perfectly still again. Her head returned to its original position as if nothing had happened. "Jake?" I called out, but heard only my own voice echoing strangely, as if the apartment had suddenly grown much larger, the walls stretching away into impossible distances. A hand grabbed my shoulder. I spun around to find Jake behind me, his face pale and drawn in the dim light. "The door," he gasped, pointing behind us. "It's gone." I looked where we'd entered and saw only a solid wall, the same pristine white as everything else in the room. No door, no exit, no way out. The walls seemed to pulse with their own inner light, and I could hear sounds within them, scratching, whispering, something that might have been laughter. The phone began ringing again. This time, when I looked at the woman in the chair, she was smiling. Not a human smile, but something predatory and wrong, stretching too wide across her face and revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. Her white eyes fixed on mine, and when she spoke, her voice came from everywhere at once. The walls, the floor, the air itself. "Welcome to the night shift." The temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath misting in the suddenly arctic air, and frost began forming on the white furniture. The dark shapes moving around the room became more distinct. Figures in paramedic uniforms, carrying equipment I recognized but couldn't name. They moved with purpose, setting up IV lines and monitors around empty spaces, as if treating patients that existed only in their own reality. One of them approached me, and I saw my own face looking back, older, more haggard, with eyes that had seen too much. He smiled and handed me a clipboard. "New admission," he said in my own voice. "Possible cardiac arrest, time of death, 2:47 a.m. I don't remember how we got out. One moment we were trapped in that impossible room with its impossible occupants, and the next we were standing on the sidewalk beside our ambulance, gasping in the cold night air like drowning men who had suddenly found the surface. My watch showed 2:47 a.m., the exact time we'd received the call. Jake was already in the driver's seat, engine running, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "Get in," he said through gritted teeth. "We're leaving. Now." "What about the woman?" We need to report the death. Call the coroner. Report what? He turned to look at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Absolute, soul-deep terror. That building's been condemned for 6 months. There is no apartment 3B. There never was. I looked back at the building where we'd just spent. How long? An hour, 5 minutes. Time seemed elastic, unreliable. Every window was boarded up with plywood, plastic sheeting fluttering in the night breeze where glass should have been. A large sign posted by the city read, "Condemned, no entry. Structure unsafe. Violators will be prosecuted." The building looked like it had been empty for years. We drove back to the station in silence, both of us trying to process what we'd experienced. Jake's hands never stopped trembling, and I caught him checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, as if expecting to see something following us through the empty streets. At the station, we filed our report as a no patient found call. Dispatch had no record of the original call, no 911 recording, no caller information, nothing in the system to indicate we'd ever been sent to 1247 Kedzie Avenue. According to their logs, Unit 47 had been out of service for vehicle maintenance from 2:30 to 3:15 a.m. Jake retired the next week, citing family reasons and a desire to spend more time with his grandchildren. He moved to Florida, and we never spoke again, though I heard through mutual friends that he'd started drinking heavily and rarely left his house after dark. I stayed on the job, told myself it had been stress, exhaustion, some kind of shared hallucination brought on by too many night shifts and too much caffeine. Carbon monoxide exposure from a faulty heating system in the building, maybe, causing us both to experience the same vivid delusions. I read medical journals about folie à deux and mass hysteria, anything that might explain what we'd experienced in rational, scientific terms. But 3 months later, I was working with a new partner, Rodriguez, a young kid fresh out of EMT school with bright eyes and an eagerness to save the world, when the radio crackled to life at 2:47 a.m. Unit 47, Priority 1, Dispatch. Possible cardiac arrest, 1247 Kedzie Avenue, Apartment 3B. Caller reports, subject unresponsive, cold to touch. My blood turned to ice water. Rodriguez was already reaching for the keys, but I grabbed his wrist hard enough to leave bruises. "No," I said, my voice coming out as a harsh whisper. "We're not taking that call." I keyed the radio with trembling fingers. Dispatch, Unit 47. That building is condemned. City records show it's been unoccupied for 6 months. There is no apartment 3B. Long pause, static. Then, Unit 47, please confirm your location. We show no active calls at that address. No record of any dispatch to Kedzie Avenue tonight. But I could hear it in the background, transmitted through the static like a ghost signal bleeding through from another dimension. A phone ringing, and underneath it, a voice crying for help. Rodriguez stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "What's wrong with you, man? If there's someone who needs help..." "There's no one there," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure I believed them. "Trust me on this one, kid. Some calls you don't answer." The dispatches started coming every few weeks after that. Always the same address, always apartment 3B, always a woman who needed help. Sometimes other units would respond, but they'd always radio back the same thing. Building condemned, no signs of life, nothing to report. But I knew better. Somewhere in that impossible apartment, she was still sitting in her white chair, still waiting for someone to answer the phone. And the other paramedics, the shadow crew working their own night shift in a place that existed between the cracks of reality, they were still there too, treating patients that had been dead for decades, running calls that never ended. I started keeping track, writing down every dispatch to 1247 Kedzie in a notebook I hid in my locker. The pattern became clear after a few months. The calls always came at 2:47 a.m., always during the deepest part of the night shift when the boundary between the living and dead grows thin, and they were becoming more frequent. Once a month became twice a month. Twice a month became weekly. By winter, we were getting the call every few nights, and each time I had to find an excuse not to respond. Mechanical problems with the rig, another call taking priority, sudden illness that required us to return to station. My new partners started requesting transfers. They said I was too nervous, too jumpy, that I'd lost my edge. They weren't wrong. Every time the radio crackled to life after 2 a.m., my heart would start racing. Every time we drove past Kedzie Avenue, I'd find myself checking the building's windows, looking for lights that shouldn't be there. But it was Rodriguez who finally broke. 3 months into our partnership, we were parked outside a 24-hour diner, trying to stay warm and caffeinated during another endless night shift, when the call came through. Unit 47, Priority 1 Dispatch. Before I could stop him, Rodriguez had keyed the radio. Unit 47 will take that call. Rodriguez, no. But he was already pulling out of the parking lot, ignoring my protests, determined to prove that whatever had spooked me could be faced down with courage and professional competence. Young paramedics are like that. They think death is something that can be defeated with the right drugs and enough electricity. I tried calling dispatch to cancel the response, but my radio was dead. I tried grabbing the wheel, but Rodriguez pushed me away with surprising strength for such a small guy. We raced through the empty streets toward Kedzie Avenue, toward the building that shouldn't exist, toward an appointment that had been waiting for us since the night Jake and I first climbed those stairs. When we arrived, the building looked exactly as it had months before, condemned, boarded up, forgotten by the living world. But the front door stood open, and light spilled out from the lobby like a golden invitation. "See?" Rodriguez said, grabbing our equipment. "Just another call. You've been psyching yourself out over nothing." I followed him into the building because I had no choice. Because this was my job, my responsibility, my curse. The stairs creaked under our weight just as they had before, and that sweet funeral smell grew stronger with each step we climbed. Apartment 3B's door was open, light spilling out into the hallway, and there she was, still sitting in her white chair, still waiting for someone to help her, still dead, still beautiful, still smiling that terrible smile. Rodriguez approached her with textbook professionalism, checking for signs of life he wouldn't find, setting up monitors that would show only flat lines. But when he touched her skin, his confidence evaporated like morning mist. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "How long has she been dead?" "Forever," I said, because it was the truth. "She's been dead forever." That's when the phone started ringing. Rodriguez heard the voice coming from the antique rotary phone. The same desperate plea for help that had haunted my dreams for months. But unlike me, he answered it. He picked up the heavy black receiver and held it to his ear. "Hello?" he said. "This is EMS. What's your emergency?" His face went white, then gray. Then something that wasn't quite any color I'd ever seen on a living person. He held the phone away from his ear, staring at it like it had become a venomous snake. "What is it?" I asked, though I didn't want to know. It's me," he whispered. "I'm talking to myself. But the other me, he's been dead for 30 years. The lights went out. In the darkness, I heard Rodriguez scream. Not the scream of someone in pain, but the scream of someone whose understanding of reality had just been shattered beyond repair. When the lights came back on, he was gone. I found him 3 days later, sitting in his car in the parking lot of the station, staring straight ahead with empty eyes, He'd lost the ability to speak, and the doctors said he'd suffered some kind of massive psychological trauma. But I knew the truth. He'd seen himself in that other place, the night shift that never ends, and part of him had never come back. He's in a facility now, a nice place with soft walls and gentle nurses who speak to him like he's a child. Sometimes I visit, and sometimes he seems to recognize me, but mostly he just stares out the window, watching for something that never comes. I stayed on the job because I had to, because I understood now that the calls would keep coming, and someone had to be ready to not answer them. Someone had to stand guard between the world of the living and the place where the dead practice medicine on patients who will never heal. The radio is quiet now, but I can feel it building, that electric tension that comes before the storm. My shift ends in 3 hours, but the night is far from over. Somewhere in the static between radio frequencies, I can hear a phone ringing. And somewhere in a building that doesn't exist, she's still sitting in her white chair, waiting for someone to answer. Because that's what we do. We respond to calls, even when we know we shouldn't. Even when we know that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The radio crackles. My watch shows 2:46 a.m. 60 seconds until the call comes through. 60 seconds until someone else has to make the choice between helping and surviving. 60 seconds until the night shift claims another soul. But tonight, for the first time in months, I'm ready for it. I've been studying the patterns, learning the rules of this other world that bleeds through into ours during the darkest hours. And I think I've found a way to break the cycle. When the call comes, and it will come as surely as the sun will rise tomorrow, I'm going to answer it differently. I'm going to pick up that rotary phone and speak to whoever is on the other end. I'm going to find out who she really is, what she really wants, and why she's been waiting so long for someone to save her. It might destroy me, like it destroyed Rodriguez and Jake and who knows how many others, but it might also set her free. And maybe, just maybe, it will let the rest of us get back to saving the living. The radio crackles to life. Unit 47. Here we go again. The earthquake hit at 3:47 a.m. on March 15th, registering 7.2 on the Richter scale, with its epicenter just 12 miles north of Cascade Falls, Washington. I was 3 hours into my night shift when the walls of Station 19 began to shake, followed immediately by the bone-deep rumble that means the earth itself is moving in ways it was never meant to. My name is David Chen, and I've been a paramedic with Cascade County Fire and Rescue for 11 years. I've worked structure fires, mass casualty incidents, and every kind of medical emergency you can imagine. But nothing in my training had prepared me for what we'd find in the aftermath of the Cascade Falls disaster. The tremor lasted 97 seconds, long enough to feel endless, brief enough to leave you wondering if it was over or just taking a breath. As soon as the shaking stopped, our radios exploded with chatter. Dispatch was overwhelmed with calls reporting structural collapses, gas leaks, and people trapped in buildings throughout the county. But it was the call that came in 20 minutes later that changed everything. All available units respond to Riverside Elementary School, 1247 Maple Street. Multiple casualties reported. Building collapse with entrapment. This is now a mass casualty incident. Establish command structure immediately. My partner, Lieutenant Rebecca Torres, was already moving toward our rig before dispatch finished speaking. Rebecca had 14 years of experience in search and rescue operations, including specialized training in confined space rescue and technical extraction. If there were kids trapped in that school, she was exactly who you'd want responding. ETA 7 minutes, she called out as we raced through streets littered with debris and broken glass. The earthquake had hit at the worst possible time, late enough that emergency responders were operating with reduced night crews, early enough that some people were still awake and moving around, increasing the likelihood of casualties. As we approached Riverside Elementary, the scale of the disaster became apparent. The 3-story brick building, constructed in 1954, had partially collapsed along its eastern wing. The first floor appeared to have pancaked completely, with the second and third floors settling at an angle that suggested the entire structure was unstable. Fire Chief Robert Martinez was already on scene, establishing incident command in the school parking lot. Emergency vehicles filled the area: fire trucks, ambulances, police cruisers, and a technical rescue team that had been dispatched from Seattle. Portable floodlights cast harsh shadows across the wreckage, creating an otherworldly landscape of twisted metal and broken concrete. "Chen, Torres," Chief Martinez called out as we approached the command post. "We've got confirmation of at least 12 people inside when the building collapsed. Night custodial staff, a few teachers who were staying late for parent conferences, and..." He paused, his expression grim. 3 children, siblings whose mother was meeting with their teacher about academic concerns. The thought of kids trapped in that wreckage sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the March cold. "What's our assignment, Chief?" "Technical rescue is setting up for structural stabilization and primary search," he replied. "I need you and Torres to establish a treatment area and coordinate medical response. We're going to start bringing people out, and some of them are going to be in bad shape." The next 4 hours were a blur of controlled chaos. As the rescue teams worked to shore up the unstable sections of the building and cut through debris, we began receiving casualties. Survivors who'd been trapped in air pockets or protected by furniture when the floors collapsed. The first few extractions were miraculous saves. Mrs. Helen Davidson, a 3rd-grade teacher, was pulled from a void space beneath her desk with nothing more than cuts and bruises. James Morrison, the head custodian, had been protected by a maintenance room's reinforced doorframe and emerged with a broken arm and mild concussion. But as the night wore on and we penetrated deeper into the collapsed structure, the cases became more challenging. Crush injuries, suspected internal bleeding, victims who'd been unconscious for hours, in spaces with questionable air quality. Each extraction was a race against time, with the building's structural integrity deteriorating as rescue operations continued. It was just after dawn when firefighter Michael Rodriguez emerged from the debris field with an expression I'd never seen before. Rodriguez was a 20-year veteran of technical rescue operations, someone who'd pulled survivors from every kind of disaster imaginable. But something about his demeanor suggested he'd encountered something beyond his considerable experience. "We found them," he announced to the command post. "The children and their mother. Section C, basement level." Chief Martinez stepped forward immediately. "What's their condition?" Rodriguez hesitated, and in that pause, I felt my stomach tighten with dread. "They're alive," he said finally, "all 4 of them, but..." He glanced around at the assembled emergency personnel, as if unsure how to proceed. "You need to see this for yourself. We're going to need psychiatric support along with medical." Rebecca and I grabbed our trauma kits and followed Rodriguez into the controlled chaos of the rescue operation. The interior of the collapsed school was a maze of broken concrete, twisted rebar, and debris that had to be carefully navigated to avoid triggering further structural failure. Our path led down a makeshift tunnel that the rescue team had carved through the wreckage, supported by hydraulic jacks and timber shoring. The basement wasn't completely crushed, Rodriguez explained as we made our way through the tunnel. There's a section near the old boiler room where the ceiling held, creating a space about 8 by 12 feet. That's where we found them. The air in the tunnel was thick with concrete dust and the acrid smell of twisted metal. Our headlamps created a narrow cone of visibility in the oppressive darkness, and I could hear the building settling around us with occasional groans and creaks that suggested the entire structure was slowly succumbing to gravity. "Here," Rodriguez said, stopping beside a narrow opening that had been cut through a concrete wall. "They're in there, but before you go in—" He grabbed my arm, his expression serious. "Don't believe everything you see at first. The stress, the darkness, being trapped for hours, it can play tricks on your mind." Rebecca and I exchanged glances. Rodriguez wasn't the type to speak in riddles or waste time with psychological speculation. If he was warning us about perceptual issues, there was a reason. I crawled through the opening first, emerging into a space that was larger than Rodriguez had described. My headlamp revealed a basement room that had been converted into some kind of storage area, with metal shelving units that had been knocked over during the earthquake. But the ceiling had held, supported by thick concrete beams that had distributed the weight of the collapsed floors above. In the far corner of the room, huddled together on a section of floor that had been cleared of debris, were 4 figures. 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, ranging in age from about 6 to 12, and a woman who was presumably their mother. They were conscious, alert, and showed no obvious signs of injury, but something about the scene felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately identify. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "I'm David. I'm a paramedic. We're here to get you out." The woman looked up at me, and I saw tears of relief streaming down her face. "Thank God," she whispered. "I thought, we've been down here for so long. I thought no one would find us." Rebecca crawled through the opening behind me, immediately beginning her assessment of the situation. "Any injuries?" she asked, approaching the family with the careful movements of someone trained to recognize hidden trauma. "The children seem okay," the mother replied. "I'm Sarah Mitchell. These are my kids, Emma, Kyle, and Lucy. When the shaking started, we were in Miss Davidson's classroom for a conference. I grabbed the kids and we ran for the stairwell, but everything came down so fast." As she spoke, I was conducting my own visual assessment of the family. Standard protocol for trapped victims includes checking for signs of dehydration, hypothermia, crush injuries, and psychological distress. But what I observed didn't match what I expected from people who'd been trapped in a collapsed building for nearly 8 hours. Their clothing was clean. Not just relatively clean considering the circumstances, but pristine. No dust, no debris, no stains from spending hours in a basement filled with concrete powder and building materials. Their hair was neat, their faces washed, and they showed no signs of the stress and fatigue that should have been obvious after their ordeal. "How long have you been down here?" Rebecca asked, beginning to set up our portable monitoring equipment. "Since the earthquake," Sarah replied. "We found this room and decided to wait for rescue, rather than try to find our way out in the dark. But as I looked around the space more carefully, I noticed other anomalies. There was no debris near where the family had been sitting. The area around them was completely clear, as if someone had spent considerable time cleaning it. More disturbing was the presence of fresh water in containers that looked like they'd been recently filled, and food packages that appeared to have been opened that morning. "Mrs. Mitchell," I said carefully, "where did this food and water come from?" She looked at me with an expression of mild confusion. "What food and water?" I pointed to the containers I'd observed, but when I turned to look at them again, they were gone. In their place were empty bottles and containers that looked like they'd been dry for weeks. Rebecca caught my eye, and I could see she'd noticed the same discrepancies. She moved closer to the children, speaking in the gentle tone she used for pediatric patients. "Emma, Kyle, Lucy, Can you tell me how you're feeling? Are you hungry or thirsty?" The youngest girl, Lucy, looked up with bright, clear eyes. "We're okay," she said in a voice that was too calm, too composed for a 6-year-old who'd just survived a building collapse. The man brought us food and water. Sarah immediately corrected her. "Honey, there's no man down here. It's just been the 4 of us." But Lucy insisted. "The nice man in the uniform, he brought us sandwiches and milk. He said the rescue people would come soon." Kyle, who appeared to be about 10, nodded in agreement. He had a flashlight, but it didn't make regular light. It made light that showed us things. "What kind of things?" Rebecca asked, her voice carefully neutral. The other people, Emma, the oldest child, replied matter-of-factly. "The ones who were here before us. They're still here, but they're not scared anymore." I felt the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Rebecca and I exchanged another glance, and I could see she was thinking the same thing I was, that the stress of entrapment was causing the children to experience hallucinations or confabulations. But as I moved my headlamp beam around the room, I began to notice details that shouldn't have been there. Scratches on the walls that looked like they'd been made by fingernails. Dark stains on the concrete floor that could have been water damage, but were arranged in patterns that suggested something else entirely. The man told us about the other families, Kyle continued, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone children use when discussing something they accept without question. The ones who got trapped here during the fire, and the flood, and the other earthquake. Sarah was looking increasingly distressed by her children's statements. "Kids, please. You're scaring me with these stories. There's no man down here, and there haven't been other families." But as she spoke, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps above us, moving through the debris with a slow, deliberate pace that suggested someone walking rather than rescue workers crawling through unstable wreckage. Rebecca heard it too. She keyed her radio to contact the surface team. "Command, this is Torres. Are there any personnel operating directly above our current position?" "Static." Then Rodriguez's voice, tight with concern. "Negative, Torres. The floor above you isn't stable enough for personnel access. Why?" Before Rebecca could respond, Lucy spoke up again. "That's him coming back. He said he needed to check on the others before the rescue people took us away." The footsteps stopped directly overhead, and in the sudden silence I became aware of another sound. Breathing that didn't belong to any of the 6 people in the room. Deep, labored breathing that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "We need to evacuate this space immediately," I said to Rebecca, abandoning any pretense of completing a standard medical assessment. "Something's not right here." But as I turned toward the opening we'd used to enter the room, I found it had changed. Instead of the narrow tunnel Rodriguez had cut through the debris, there was now a larger opening that led to what appeared to be a corridor extending deeper into the building's basement level. "That's not possible," Rebecca whispered. "We just came through there 5 minutes ago." Sarah was staring at the new opening with an expression of recognition rather than surprise. "That's the way he went," she said quietly. "When he brought us here. He said this room was special, that families could wait here safely until rescue arrived." "What families?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I didn't want to know the answer. Emma pointed to different areas of the room. "The Johnson family from 1987, the Martinez family from 1994, the Williams family from 2003. They're all still here, waiting for rescue." As she spoke, I began to see them. Faint at first, like shadows cast by light sources that weren't there, but gradually becoming more distinct. Families huddled in different sections of the room, wearing clothing from different decades, all showing the same pristine condition and calm demeanor as the Mitchell family. A family from the 1980s, the parents wearing business attire that had been fashionable during the Reagan era. Children from the 1990s in flannel shirts and jeans. Teenagers from the early 2000s with the hairstyles and clothing trends I remembered from my own high school years. All of them waiting patiently for rescue that had never come. "How long have you been down here?" Rebecca asked Sarah again, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining professional composure. Sarah looked confused by the question. "Since the earthquake," she repeated. "But—" She paused, her expression becoming uncertain. "What year is it?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "It's 2024, I said. March 15th, 2024. Sarah's face went white. "That can't be right," she whispered. Emma's parent conference was scheduled for March 15th, 2019. We were meeting with her teacher about her reading level. The implications of what she was saying crashed over me like cold water. I looked at the children again, really looked at them, and realized that their clothing wasn't just clean. It was 5 years out of style. Emma's backpack bore the logo of a popular children's show that had been canceled in 2020. Kyle's shoes were a model that had been discontinued before the pandemic. "The earthquake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "The earthquake you were in, when exactly did it happen?" "March 15th, Sarah replied. "March 15th, 2019. But there had been no earthquake in Cascade Falls in 2019. No building collapse at Riverside Elementary. No mass casualty incident that would have brought us here in the first place." I keyed my radio with shaking hands. "Command, this is Chen. I need confirmation on the date and nature of today's incident." Rodriguez's voice came through clearly. "Today is March 15th, 2024. Building collapse at Riverside Elementary following a 7.2 earthquake at 03 for 7 hours. What's your status down there?" I looked around the room again, seeing not just the Mitchell family and the Phantom families from other decades, but understanding for the first time the true nature of what we'd encountered. "The man in the uniform," I said to Emma. "Can you describe him?" "He looks like you," she replied. "Like a paramedic. He has the same kind of equipment, the same uniform. But his name tag is different. It says Johnson instead of Chen." My blood turned to ice. Thomas Johnson had been a paramedic with Cascade County Fire and Rescue in the 1980s. He'd died in a building collapse during a rescue operation in 1987, along with the family he'd been trying to evacuate. "He tells all the families the same thing," Kyle added. "That rescue is coming, that they just need to wait in the special room where they'll be safe. He brings food and water, and he makes sure no one gets scared." Rebecca was backing toward the opening, her face pale in the beam of my headlamp. "We need to leave, now." But as we moved toward the exit, the corridor beyond began to extend, stretching away into distances that couldn't possibly exist within the confines of the collapsed school. And walking toward us through that impossible space was a figure in a paramedic uniform from the 1980s, carrying equipment that had been obsolete for decades. "Don't be afraid," he said in a voice that carried the calm authority of someone trained to handle emergencies. "I'm here to help. These families are waiting for rescue, and I need to make sure they're comfortable while they wait." "How long have they been waiting?" Rebecca asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Time works differently here," Johnson replied. "They're safe, they're comfortable, and they're together. That's what matters, but you—" He looked at us with an expression of professional concern. "You're not supposed to be here yet. Your rescue isn't scheduled until much later." The corridor was lengthening behind him, revealing more spaces, more rooms, more families from different disasters spanning decades. All of them waiting patiently for rescue operations that had ended long ago, cared for by emergency responders who died trying to save them. "This isn't real," I said, though my words sounded hollow even to me. "This is stress-induced hallucination, oxygen deprivation, something." Johnson smiled with the patient understanding of someone who'd heard the same denial countless times. "Real is relative when you're between life and death. These families are real. Their need for help is real. And my responsibility to provide that help is real." He gestured back toward the Mitchell family, who were now standing with the other phantom families in what had become a much larger space than the storage room we'd originally entered. "They've been waiting for someone to find them," he continued. "Someone to acknowledge their situation and provide the help they need. You've done that. Now they can move on to whatever comes next." As he spoke, the families began to fade, not disappearing, but becoming translucent, as if they were moving into a different dimension of existence. One by one, they smiled and waved, then dissolved into the strange light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The Mitchell family was the last to go. Sarah approached us one final time, her expression peaceful in a way that transcended the fear and confusion she'd shown earlier. "Thank you," she said simply, "for finding us, for believing us, for giving us permission to stop waiting." Then they were gone, and we were alone in a small storage room filled with debris from a building collapse that had happened 5 years after their deaths. Johnson remained, watching us with the professional concern of a paramedic assessing patients. "Your situation is different," he told us. "You have a choice. You can leave now, return to the surface and continue your work among the living. Or you can stay and help me care for the others who are still waiting." "Others?" Rebecca asked. "There are always others," he replied. "Every disaster, every emergency, every situation where people are trapped and afraid. Some get rescued by the living. Others require different kinds of help." The corridor behind him had become an endless series of rooms, each containing families from different disasters, different decades, different circumstances. All of them waiting for rescue workers who would understand their situation and provide the help they needed. "The choice is yours," Johnson said, "but choose carefully. Time works differently here, and once you commit to staying, leaving becomes complicated." I looked at Rebecca, seeing my own internal struggle reflected in her expression. We'd become paramedics to help people, to save lives, to provide care in the worst circumstances imaginable. But this was beyond anything we'd trained for, beyond the boundaries of life and death as we understood them. "If we stay," Rebecca asked, "what happens to our lives, our families, our work in the world above?" "That depends on how you choose to stay," Johnson replied. "Some of us continue our regular duties while also serving here. Others dedicate themselves entirely to this work. The need is great and the responsibilities are extensive." Through the opening we'd originally used to enter the room, I could hear Rodriguez calling our names, searching for us in the debris. The real world, with its concrete disasters and measurable tragedies, was waiting for our return. But I could also see the families still waiting in those impossible rooms, still needing help that only someone with our training and experience could provide. "We'll come back," I told Johnson finally. "When our shift above is finished, when our responsibilities to the living are fulfilled. We'll come back and help with the others." He nodded with understanding. "The opening will be here when you're ready. It always is, for those who truly want to help." We crawled back through the tunnel to the surface, emerging into a world of morning sunlight and controlled emergency operations. Rodriguez was waiting for us, his expression relieved and concerned. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded. "You've been missing for 3 hours. We were about to send a search team." 3 hours. We'd spent what felt like 20 minutes in that basement room, but according to our radios and the position of the sun, we'd been gone for half a shift. "The family," Rebecca said. "The Mitchell family. Did you find them?" Rodriguez looked confused. "What family?" "We've accounted for everyone who was in the building. No family named Mitchell, no children. The last casualty was extracted an hour ago." I checked the official incident report later that day. No record of a Mitchell family at Riverside Elementary on March the 15th, 2019 or 2024. No children by those names enrolled at the school. No parent conference scheduled for that date. But in the basement of that collapsed building, accessible through openings that appeared only when they were needed, Johnson continues his work, caring for families displaced by disasters that exist in the spaces between official records and measurable reality. Sometimes, on particularly difficult calls, I catch glimpses of those impossible corridors. I see families waiting patiently for help that goes beyond medical protocols and emergency procedures. And I remember my promise to return when my shift above is finished. Because some rescue operations never end. Some emergencies exist outside the boundaries of time and space, and some patients require care that only the dead can provide to the dying. The work continues, above and below, in the spaces where disaster victims wait for rescue. Workers who understand that help comes in many forms, and someday, when my responsibilities to the living are complete, I'll crawl back through that opening and join Johnson in providing care to those who need it most. After all, a paramedic's duty doesn't end with the shift. It ends when everyone has been helped. The call came in at 11:43 p.m. on a rain-soaked Friday night in Seattle. The kind of call that makes your stomach tighten before you even hear the details. Psychiatric emergency at Fairview State Hospital. Dispatch crackled through our radio. Multiple patients involved, staff requesting immediate EMS response for possible injuries. Police en route. Fairview State Hospital. I'd been working as a paramedic in King County for 8 years, and that name still sent a chill down my spine. The old psychiatric facility had been scheduled for closure twice in the past decade, only to remain open due to overcrowding at newer facilities. Built in 1952, it was a sprawling complex of brick buildings connected by underground tunnels, housing some of the most severely mentally ill patients in the Pacific Northwest. My partner, Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, was already plotting our route as I acknowledged the call. Sarah had 15 years of experience in psychiatric emergencies, including a stint as a crisis intervention specialist before becoming a paramedic. If anyone could handle whatever was waiting for us at Fairview, it was her. "What's our ETA?" she asked, navigating through the late-night traffic with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd driven these streets thousands of times. 12 minutes, I replied, checking our GPS. "You ever been inside Fairview?" Sarah's expression darkened. "Once, about 5 years ago. Patient had swallowed a light bulb, the place ... She paused, searching for the right words. "There's something wrong with that building, not just the patients, the building itself. Like it remembers every scream that's ever echoed through those halls." As we approached the hospital complex, I could see why Sarah felt that way. Fairview State Hospital looked like something from a Victorian horror novel. Imposing brick structures with narrow windows and Gothic architectural details that seemed designed to keep things in rather than welcome visitors. Security lights cast harsh shadows across the grounds, creating pools of brightness separated by vast areas of darkness. The main entrance was a flurry of activity. Police cruisers lined the circular drive, their red and blue lights painting the wet pavement in alternating colors. I could see officers setting up a perimeter around one of the side buildings, Ward 7, according to the faded sign beside the entrance. Unit 23, what's your status? Dispatch queried as we pulled up to the command post. Unit 23 on scene, Sarah responded. Making contact with Incident Commander now. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez of the Seattle PD met us at our ambulance, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious tension. "Glad you're here," he said without preamble. "We've got a situation in Ward 7 that's unprecedented." "How many patients are we dealing with?" I asked, grabbing our psychiatric emergency kit, restraints, sedatives, and protective equipment designed for volatile situations. "That's just it," Rodriguez replied. "According to the staff, there should be 28 patients in that ward, but when this started, they could only account for 15. The others—" He gestured helplessly toward the darkened building. "They're somewhere in there, but we can't locate them." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean you can't locate them? It's a secured psychiatric ward. Where could they go?" "That's what we're trying to figure out." The head nurse, Janet Morrison, was making her 11 p.m. rounds when she heard what she described as coordinated whispering coming from multiple rooms. When she investigated, she found several patients missing from their beds. No signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry or exit. They just vanished. A new voice joined our conversation. A woman in scrubs who approached with the rapid, nervous movements of someone barely maintaining professional composure. "Are you the paramedics?" she asked, her voice strained with exhaustion and fear. "Janet Morrison," Rodriguez introduced. "Head nurse for Ward 7. She's the one who called this in." Janet looked like she'd aged years in the span of a few hours. Her graying hair was disheveled, her uniform wrinkled, and her hands trembled slightly as she gestured toward the building. "I've been working psychiatric care for 23 years, she said. "I've seen every kind of mental health crisis you can imagine. But this is something else entirely." "Tell us what happened," Sarah said, her voice carrying the calm authority that made her so effective in crisis situations. Janet took a shaky breath. "It started about 2 hours ago during evening medication rounds. The patients were unusually quiet, not the good kind of quiet, but an unnatural silence that felt coordinated, like they were all listening to something we couldn't hear." She led us toward the entrance of Ward 7, where 2 officers stood guard beside doors that had been propped open. Around 10:30, I began hearing whispers. Not conversation, whispers. Multiple voices, all saying the same words, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. "Could you determine which patients were involved?" I asked, checking that our radio was functioning properly. Communication was crucial in psychiatric emergencies, especially when dealing with multiple patients. "That's the thing," Janet continued. "When I checked the rooms where I thought I heard the whispering, the patients appeared to be asleep. But their positioning was wrong. They were all lying in exactly the same position, on their backs, arms at their sides, eyes closed, but—" She shuddered. "They weren't breathing like people who are asleep. The rhythm was too regular, too controlled." We entered Ward 7, and immediately I understood what Sarah had meant about the building remembering screams. The atmosphere inside was oppressive, thick with decades of human suffering and institutional neglect. Fluorescent lights flickered irregularly, casting unstable shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The ward was laid out in a typical institutional design, a central nurses' station surrounded by patient rooms with day areas and group therapy spaces at either end. But tonight, the familiar layout felt wrong. as if the spatial relationships had been subtly altered to create confusion and disorientation. The missing patients, Rodriguez said, consulting his notes, are all long-term residents with severe psychiatric conditions: schizophrenia, severe bipolar disorder, treatment-resistant depression with psychotic features. Most have been here for years, some for decades. Janet nodded grimly. They're not the kind of patients who would or could plan an escape. Several are on constant monitoring due to self-harm risks. Others require assistance with basic daily activities. The idea that they could coordinate any kind of group action is medically impossible. But as we moved deeper into the ward, it became clear that something medically impossible was exactly what we were dealing with. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but a presence of silence, a quality of quiet that felt intentional and aware. Our footsteps echoed strangely, as if the building's acoustics had been altered to amplify certain sounds while muffling others. "Room 712, Janet said, stopping beside an open doorway. "Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, age 67, catatonic schizophrenia, nonverbal for the past 8 years. She was here during my 9 p.m. check." The room was small and sparse: a hospital bed, a small dresser, and a chair arranged with institutional precision. But Eleanor Vasquez was gone, and her absence felt deliberate rather than accidental. The bed was perfectly made, the pillows arranged with mathematical precision, and on the pillow was a single word written in what looked like pencil: "Together." "She can't write," Janet whispered. "Eleanor hasn't demonstrated fine motor control in years. She can't even hold a pencil, let alone write legibly." Sarah was examining the window, secured with heavy mesh and institutional locks that showed no signs of tampering. "No way out through here. How many other rooms are we looking at?" 13 more, Rodriguez replied. All with similar conditions: missing patients, no signs of struggle, and single words written on pillows or walls. "Together. Listen. Come. Now." We continued our survey of the ward, documenting each empty room and its impossible message. The patients who remained were all in the same unnatural sleep Janet had described: too still, too controlled, breathing with mechanical regularity that suggested something other than natural rest. "We need to check the basement levels," Janet said as we completed our examination of the main floor. "Ward 7 connects to the old tunnel system that runs under the entire hospital complex. If the patients went somewhere, that's the most likely route." Rodriguez shook his head. "Those tunnels have been sealed for safety reasons: asbestos, structural damage, flooding issues. No one's supposed to have access." "Supposed to being the operative phrase," Sarah observed. "Let's take a look." The basement access was through a heavy steel door beside the nurse's station, secured with both electronic locks and a traditional key system. But when Janet swiped her access card, the door opened immediately, despite the fact that it should have required additional authorization from security. "That's not right," she muttered. "This door requires 2-person authorization. It shouldn't open with just my card." The stairwell beyond was narrow and poorly lit, with concrete walls that seemed to absorb our flashlight beams. As we descended, the oppressive atmosphere of the ward above was replaced by something even more unsettling: a sense of vast, hidden spaces stretching away into darkness. The basement level was a maze of utility corridors, storage rooms, and abandoned areas that had been closed off decades ago. Our footsteps echoed strangely, creating multiple reflections that made it difficult to determine which sounds were real and which were acoustic illusions. "The tunnel entrance should be down this way," Janet said, leading us through a series of turns that seemed designed to confuse rather than efficiently connect spaces. "But I haven't been down here in years." The layout might have changed. That's when we heard it. The coordinated whispering Janet had described. Multiple voices speaking in unison, their words just at the edge of comprehension. The sound seemed to come from ahead of us, drawing us deeper into the basement's labyrinthine structure. "Can you make out what they're saying?" I asked Sarah, who had the best hearing among our group. She listened intently for several seconds before shaking her head. "It's not English, not any language I recognize, but the rhythm. It's like a chant or incantation." Rodriguez was checking his radio, but found only static. "We've lost communication with the surface. These basement levels must be blocking our signal." The whispering grew louder as we followed the corridor toward what appeared to be the tunnel access. But when we reached the supposed entrance, we found something that shouldn't have existed. A perfectly circular chamber carved from the living rock beneath the hospital, with smooth walls that reflected our flashlight beams like polished mirrors. In the center of the chamber, arranged in a perfect circle, were the 13 missing patients. They sat cross-legged on the stone floor, their eyes closed and their lips moving in synchronized whispers. Their hospital gowns were pristine, despite the dusty, dirty environment, and their positioning was so precise it looked like it had been measured with surveying equipment. But it was their condition that truly disturbed me. These were patients with severe psychiatric disabilities, many of whom couldn't walk without assistance or maintain basic posture due to medication side effects and neurological damage. Yet here they sat with perfect spinal alignment, their movements coordinated with mechanical precision. "Eleanor!" Janet called out, approaching the circle cautiously. "Eleanor, can you hear me?" Eleanor Vasquez, the nonverbal catatonic patient we'd been told about, opened her eyes and looked directly at Janet with clear, focused awareness. When she spoke, her voice was perfectly articulated and unnaturally calm. "We have been waiting," she said. "The voices told us you would come." Janet backed away, her professional composure finally cracking. "That's impossible. She hasn't spoken in 8 years. She doesn't have the cognitive capacity for coherent speech." But Eleanor continued speaking, and as she did, the other patients opened their eyes and began to speak as well. Not in overlapping conversation, but in perfect unison, as if they were all mouthpieces for a single consciousness. "The building remembers," they said together. "Every mind that has been broken here, every soul that has been lost. We are the keepers of their pain, the vessels of their accumulated suffering." Sarah stepped forward, falling back on her crisis intervention training despite the surreal circumstances. "My name is Sarah. I'm a paramedic. We're here to help you. Can you tell me if anyone is injured or in distress?" The patients turned their heads toward her with synchronized movements, and when they smiled, it was with identical expressions that belonged on no human face. "Help?" they said in unison. "We are beyond help. We are beyond healing. We are the wound that never closes, the treatment that never ends." Rodriguez was backing toward the corridor entrance, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon despite the obvious futility of such a gesture. "We need to get out of here, now." But as he reached the doorway, he found it had vanished. Where moments before there had been an opening leading back to the basement corridor, there was now only smooth stone wall, as if the chamber had sealed itself around us. "That's not possible," I said, running my hands over the wall surface. It was seamless, unbroken, as if it had been carved from a single piece of stone with no entrance or exit. The patients were standing now, moving with the same mechanical precision they'd shown while sitting. They formed a loose circle around us, and I could see that their eyes had changed. No longer the various colors of individual human irises, but uniform black that reflected our flashlight beams like oil. "You came to help," they said together. You came to heal, but some wounds are meant to remain open. Some pain is meant to be preserved. Janet was hyperventilating, her medical training warring with the reality of what she was witnessing. These patients, I've treated them for years. I know their medical histories, their limitations. This isn't possible. Possibility, the patients chanted, is determined by perspective. From your perspective, we are mentally ill. From our perspective, we are the most sane beings in this building. They began to move closer, and I could see that their synchronized movements weren't quite human. Their gait was too smooth, too coordinated, like marionettes operated by a master puppeteer. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, maintaining her professional calm despite the impossible circumstances. "To share," they replied, "to show you what we have learned in our years of treatment, our decades of healing attempts, our lifetimes of being told that our perceptions are symptoms rather than insights." The chamber was getting smaller, not rapidly, but noticeably, the walls closing in with the inexorable patience of geological processes. Our circle of light was shrinking as the patients drew closer, and I could feel the weight of the building above us, the accumulated pressure of decades of institutional medicine and human suffering. The medications, the patients continued their unified speech, were meant to quiet the voices. But the voices weren't symptoms, they were warnings. They told us what this place really is, what it does to the minds it claims to heal. Rodriguez was checking his equipment, looking for anything that might serve as a tool or weapon. "How do we get out of here?" "You don't," the patients replied with their terrible, synchronized smile. "You become part of the treatment, part of the healing process, part of the wound that never closes." That's when I understood what was happening. This wasn't a psychiatric emergency in any conventional sense. We were dealing with something that had been growing in the basement of Fairview State Hospital for decades. A collective consciousness formed from the accumulated suffering of patients who'd been told their perceptions were delusions. Their insights were symptoms, their awareness was illness. "You think we're crazy," Eleanor Vasquez said, her voice distinct from the group for the first time. "But we see things you can't see. We hear things you can't hear. We know things you refuse to know." The other patients nodded in unison. "The building feeds on minds," they chanted. "It grows stronger with each treatment, each medication, each electroshock therapy session. Every time someone's perception is dismissed as illness, the building gains another voice." The walls continued to close, and our flashlights were beginning to dim. But in the growing darkness, I could see something that made my blood run cold. Figures moving in the shadows beyond our circle of light. More patients, dozens of them, emerging from passages that shouldn't have existed. "How many are there?" Sarah whispered. "All of them," Janet replied, her voice hollow with realization. "Every patient who's ever died in this building, every mind that's ever been broken by the treatment process. They're all still here." The shadow figures were becoming more distinct as they approached, patients from different eras, wearing hospital gowns from different decades, their faces bearing the expressions of people who'd been told their entire lives that their perceptions were invalid. "We tried to tell the doctors," they said in a whisper that came from everywhere at once. "We tried to explain what we could see, what we could hear, but they called it illness. They called it delusion. They tried to make us forget. But the building remembers," the original 13 patients continued. "And now it's time for the healers to understand what healing really means." The chamber had shrunk to the point where we were pressed together in the center, surrounded by dozens of figures whose existence challenged everything I understood about life, death, and psychiatric medicine. Our radios were completely dead, our flashlights failing. and the walls continued their slow but inevitable convergence. "There has to be a way out," I said, though I was beginning to doubt my own words. "There is," Eleanor replied, stepping forward from the circle of patients. "But it requires accepting what you've spent your careers denying. That perception isn't always illness. That awareness isn't always delusion. That sometimes the people you're trying to heal are the only ones who can see clearly." Sarah looked at me, then at Rodriguez and Janet. I could see her making the same calculation I was, that conventional solutions weren't going to work here, that we needed to approach this situation with something other than medical protocols and police procedures. "What do you see?" she asked Eleanor. "What are we missing?" Eleanor's expression softened, and for a moment I could see the person she'd been before. Decades of institutional treatment had stripped away her voice and her agency. "We see the suffering this place has caused," she said. "We see the minds that have been broken in the name of healing. We see the awareness that has been labeled as illness because it was inconvenient or frightening." The other patients nodded. "The building feeds on denial," they said together. "Every time someone's experience is dismissed as symptoms, it grows stronger. Every time awareness is medicated away, it gains another voice. But acknowledgement," Eleanor continued, "weakens it. Recognition of truth diminishes its power. That's why you're here, not to rescue us, but to witness what we've experienced." The walls stopped moving. In the sudden stillness, I could hear my own heartbeat, Sarah's breathing, the slight shift of Rodriguez's equipment. Normal sounds in an abnormal situation. "You want us to validate your experiences," I said, beginning to understand. "To acknowledge that what you've perceived isn't necessarily illness." "Not all of it," Eleanor replied. "Some of it is illness. We're not delusional about our conditions. But some of it is awareness that's been systematically suppressed because it threatens the foundation of institutional psychiatry." Janet stepped forward, her voice shaking. "I've worked here for 23 years. I've administered medications, assisted with treatments, watched patients deteriorate despite our best efforts. If what you're saying is true, then you've been part of a system that creates the very problems it claims to solve," the patients said in unison. "But recognition of that truth is the beginning of actual healing." The shadow figures were becoming less distinct, fading back into the darkness, as if our acknowledgement of their experience was allowing them to rest. The chamber began to expand, returning to its original dimensions. "The way out," Eleanor said, "is through acceptance. Not of our illness, but of our humanity. Our right to experience reality in ways that don't conform to medical textbooks." One by one, the patients returned to their positions on the floor, resuming their meditation or rest or whatever state they'd been in when we found them. But their eyes remained clear, aware, focused on a reality that encompassed more than what our training had taught us to see. The doorway reappeared, leading back to the basement corridor. Our radios crackled back to life, and our flashlights brightened as if someone had replaced the batteries. "The missing patients," Rodriguez said as we prepared to leave the chamber. "What do we report?" Eleanor smiled, and this time it was a human expression rather than the synchronized mask she'd worn earlier. "We were never missing," she said. "We were exactly where we needed to be." We made our way back to the surface in silence, each of us processing what we'd experienced in our own way. When we emerged into Ward 7, we found the remaining patients awake and alert, sitting up in their beds and engaging in quiet conversations that seemed perfectly normal and appropriate. Janet went to check on Eleanor's room and found her there, lying peacefully in her bed as if she'd never left. But when Janet approached, Eleanor opened her eyes and spoke clearly. "Thank you for listening." The official report listed the incident as a false alarm. Confused communications during a shift change had led to inaccurate patient counts, and the whispering had been traced to a malfunctioning ventilation system that created acoustic illusions. All patients were accounted for and showed no signs of distress or unusual behavior. But Janet submitted her resignation the following week, citing personal reasons. Rodriguez requested a transfer to a different district, and Sarah and I found ourselves approaching psychiatric calls with a different perspective, one that considered the possibility that not all unusual perceptions were symptoms of illness. 3 months later, Fairview State Hospital was finally closed, its patients transferred to more modern facilities with better therapeutic approaches. The building was demolished 6 months after that, and a park was built on the site. But sometimes when I drive past that park on quiet nights, I can see figures in the shadows between the trees. People sitting in circles, engaged in what looks like meditation or group therapy. And I wonder if some forms of healing happen outside the boundaries of conventional medicine, in spaces where awareness is validated rather than medicated away. The voices Janet heard that night weren't symptoms of illness. They were the sound of minds reclaiming their right to experience reality on their own terms, to find healing through acceptance rather than suppression. And sometimes that's the most effective treatment of all. The call came in at 4:23 a.m. on a Tuesday that felt like the end of the world. Industrial accident at the old Riverside Steel Mill, a place that had been shuttered for 8 years, its windows shattered and machinery rusting in the Pennsylvania rain. The voice on the other end of a 911 was panicked, nearly incoherent, reporting screams and what sounded like heavy machinery running in a building that hadn't seen power since the Obama administration. "Probably just kids," my partner Maria said as we raced through the empty streets of Millbrook, our siren echoing off abandoned storefronts and boarded-up houses that stood like broken teeth in the pre-dawn darkness. Urban explorers, maybe. Fell through some rotten flooring or got tangled up in old cables. I wanted to agree with her, but something about the 911 call nagged at me like a splinter under my skin. The caller, a long-haul trucker passing by on Route 19, had described sounds that didn't match teenage exploration. Grinding metal, hydraulic hissing, the rhythmic pounding of industrial hammers, and underneath it all, human screaming that went on far too long for someone who'd simply taken a fall. The mill loomed ahead of us like a monument to industrial decay, its massive silhouette cutting a jagged wound against the pre-dawn sky. 4 stories of red brick and broken dreams, with smokestacks that reached toward heaven like the fingers of a buried giant. Chain-link fence surrounded the property, topped with razor wire and decorated with signs warning of hazardous materials, structural instability, and prosecution for trespassing. But the front gate hung open, its heavy lock cut clean through with bolt cutters that had left metal shavings scattered on the asphalt. "Fresh cut," Maria observed, kneeling to examine the severed chain. Her breath misted in the cold air, and I could see goosebumps rising on her forearms despite the heavy uniform jacket. "Someone's been here recently, maybe within the last few hours." We grabbed our trauma kit and scene safety equipment from the rig, including portable lighting, rope for potential extraction, and the heavy-duty first aid supplies we'd need if someone had been crushed by falling machinery. The mill's main entrance had been welded shut years ago, thick steel plates covering what had once been glass doors where thousands of workers had passed each day. But we found a service door on the east side that had been forced open, its metal frame bent outward as if something had exploded from within rather than broken in from outside. The smell hit us immediately as we approached the breach: oil, rust, and something organic that made my stomach clench and my sinuses burn. Not decay exactly, but something alive and wrong, like blood mixed with machine lubricant and the metallic tang of superheated steel. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing through the cavernous space beyond the doorway. "EMS, Millbrook Fire and Rescue. Is anyone injured in there?" The response came not in words, but in sound, a low, rhythmic grinding that seemed to come from deep within the building, accompanied by the hiss of hydraulic systems and the distant clang of metal on metal. It was mechanical, deliberate, the sound of massive gears turning and pistons firing, despite the fact that the mill had been disconnected from the power grid for nearly a decade. Maria's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a scene that belonged in an industrial museum. Conveyor belts frozen mid-motion, overhead cranes hanging like sleeping giants, and workstations where men had once shaped raw steel into the bones of America's infrastructure. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and debris, rusted metal shavings, broken glass, and the detritus of abandonment. Everything except for one area near the center of the floor. A path had been cleared through the accumulated filth, leading from the entrance we'd used to what looked like the main production line. The path was too clean, too deliberate to be random exploration. Someone had been here recently, and they'd had a specific destination in mind. More disturbing were the drag marks in the dust on either side of the cleared path. Parallel grooves that looked like something heavy had been pulled across the floor. "This doesn't feel right," Maria whispered, her usually steady voice betraying the concern that was growing in my own chest. "Maybe we should call for backup. Get some officers out here before we go any deeper." But as she spoke, we heard it again. Not machinery this time, but human voices. Faint, distant, coming from somewhere deeper in the mill's labyrinthine interior. One voice was calling for help in a way that made my chest tighten with professional urgency, the desperate cry of someone in genuine medical distress. The other was laughing, a sound that belonged in no workplace, abandoned or otherwise. We followed the cleared path deeper into the mill, our flashlights creating a small bubble of visibility in an ocean of industrial darkness. The grinding sound grew louder with each step, joined now by other mechanical noises that shouldn't have been possible. Hydraulic pumps cycling, conveyor motors humming, the whistle of pressurized steam. Impossible sounds from machines that should have been silent as graves. The layout of the mill was a maze of catwalks, support pillars, and suspended equipment that created shadows within shadows. Our beams revealed glimpses of the past. Safety posters from the 1990s still clinging to walls. Hard hats hanging on pegs as if their owners had just stepped away for lunch. Time clocks with punch cards scattered on the floor like fallen leaves. "There," Maria pointed ahead with her light beam, her voice tight with tension. "The blast furnace area." The mill's central blast furnace rose before us like an iron cathedral, its massive structure disappearing into the shadows above. But what drew our attention was the smaller equipment arranged around its base. Machines that were definitely running despite having no apparent power source. Overhead, conveyor systems moved with deliberate purpose, carrying something that glinted dully in our flashlight beams. Control panels that should have been dark showed glowing indicators, and steam rose from pipes that should have been cold and empty. And standing beside the main control panel, operating the machinery with the casual expertise of someone who'd worked there for decades, was a man in coveralls that should have been uniform gray, but appeared to be stained with something dark and wet. "Sir," I called out, approaching with my hands visible and my voice pitched to carry over the mechanical noise. Standard protocol for approaching potentially injured civilians in unstable environments. "I'm with EMS. Are you injured? Did you call for help?" He turned toward us with movements that seemed too fluid, too practiced for someone who should have been startled by our sudden appearance. In the harsh beam of Maria's flashlight, I saw a face that belonged to another era entirely. His features were sharp and angular, carved from some harder material than flesh, and his eyes were sunken deep in their sockets like dark holes in a skull. His skin had a pale, waxy quality that reminded me of old daguerreotypes, and when he smiled, it was with teeth that seemed too numerous and too sharp for a human mouth. "Help?" He laughed, and the sound echoed strangely off the metal walls, bouncing back at us from multiple directions, as if the mill itself was joining in his amusement. "Oh, I'm beyond help, friends. Have been for quite some time now. But you're just in time for the next batch." That's when I saw what the conveyor system was carrying. Not scrap metal or industrial materials, but human forms. Bodies on makeshift stretchers, some moving weakly, others perfectly still. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light and the horrible reality of what I was seeing, I could make out the details that would haunt my dreams for years to come. Men and women in various states of injury and consciousness, their clothes torn and stained with blood, being transported along the overhead track toward the blast furnace like offerings to some industrial god. "Jesus Christ," Maria whispered, her flashlight beam trembling as she tracked the movement of the conveyor. Are those people?" The man in coveralls followed our gaze and nodded with satisfaction, like a factory foreman showing off his operation to visiting executives. "My workers," he said with obvious pride. "Been collecting them for years now. Urban explorers, copper thieves, homeless folks looking for shelter. They come to my mill thinking it's abandoned, but really, I've just been waiting for the right employees." One of the forms on the conveyor belt stirred, lifting its head weakly, and I saw the face of a young woman, maybe 25, with blood matting her blonde hair. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming what looked like the word "help" over and over again. Training kicked in despite the surreal horror of the situation. I stepped forward, reaching for my radio to call for immediate backup and additional ambulances. "Sir, I need you to step away from those controls. We're going to get these people down from there and get them medical attention." But as I moved, the machinery around us suddenly roared to life with deafening intensity. The grinding sound became a metallic scream, and the conveyor belt began moving faster, carrying its human cargo toward the open mouth of the blast furnace. The man in coveralls laughed louder, his voice somehow cutting through the mechanical cacophony. "You don't understand," he shouted over the noise. "They're not going to medical attention, they're going to work, forever and ever just like me." That's when I noticed the others, moving between the machines, tending to controls and adjusting mechanisms, were more figures in coveralls. Dozens of them, all with the same pale, waxy skin and sunken eyes. Some were missing limbs, others had obvious crush injuries or burns, but they all moved with the same fluid efficiency, and they were all looking at us now, turning away from their tasks to focus on the two new arrivals in their domain. "Maria," I said quietly, backing slowly toward the path we'd followed into the mill. "We need to leave, now." But Maria wasn't moving. She stood transfixed, her flashlight beam fixed on something near the blast furnace. Following her gaze, I saw what had frozen her in place. Suspended from hooks near the furnace's opening were dozens of uniforms: police, fire department, EMS. Some were recent, others looked decades old, but all bore the unmistakable stains of violence. And among them, hanging like a grisly trophy, was a paramedic jacket with Millbrook Fire Rescue emblazoned across the back. That's Jimmy's jacket," Maria whispered. Jimmy Kowalski had been a paramedic with our service who'd disappeared 6 months ago while responding to a call. His body was never found, and the investigation had eventually gone cold. But that's impossible. He never came here. The man in coveralls heard her and smiled wider, revealing more of those too numerous teeth. Oh, but he did. They all do, eventually. The mill calls to them, you see. Calls to all the helpers, all the ones who think they can save people. He gestured to the uniforms with obvious pride. We have quite a collection now. Police officers, firefighters, paramedics, social workers, everyone who ever thought they could make a difference. The workers were moving closer now, emerging from behind machinery and descending from catwalks with the inexorable patience of the dead. Their movements were wrong, too coordinated, too purposeful, like parts of a vast machine rather than individual beings. You see, the foreman continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining a simple concept to children. The mill never really closed. It just changed what it produces. Used to make steel. Now it makes workers. Forever workers who never tire, never complain, never go home at the end of their shift. I grabbed Maria's arm, trying to snap her out of her trance. We're leaving, right now. But when I turned toward our exit, I found the path blocked by more workers. They stood in perfect formation, their pale faces eerily calm, their dark eyes reflecting our flashlight beams like mirrors. Behind them, the machinery continued to roar, and the conveyor belt continued to carry its human cargo toward an unthinkable fate. Now, the foreman said, approaching us with his hands outstretched in what might have been a welcoming gesture if not for the blood caked under his fingernails. No need to rush off. You came here to help, didn't you? Well, these people need help. They need to learn their new jobs, adapt to their new circumstances. You can assist with that. One of the forms on the conveyor belt, a middle-aged man in a torn flannel shirt, lifted his head and locked eyes with me. His mouth was moving, and even over the mechanical noise, I could hear him crying out, "Please, help me. I have kids. Please." Every instinct I developed in 15 years of emergency medicine screamed at me to do something, to help, to find a way to get these people down and out of danger. But the rational part of my brain, the part that had kept me alive through countless dangerous calls, recognized a trap when I saw one. The thing about helpers, the foreman continued conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather rather than standing in an industrial hell, is that they can't help themselves. It's not in their nature to walk away from someone in need. That's what makes them such excellent raw material. Maria suddenly broke from her paralysis, fumbling for her radio. "Dispatch Unit 12, we have multiple casualties at the Riverside Mill. Possible entrapment. Requesting immediate..." Static. Dead air. The radio was completely silent, not even picking up the usual background chatter that connected us to the outside world. "Communication's always been a problem here," the foreman said apologetically. "Something about the iron content in the building materials. Plays hell with radio signals. Don't worry, though, you won't need to call anyone. You'll be staying." The workers began closing in from all sides, moving with that same mechanical precision. Up close, I could see the details of their condition more clearly. The crushed limbs that had been roughly repaired with wire and metal plates. The burns that had been treated with patches of some unidentifiable material. The missing eyes replaced with dark sockets that somehow still seemed to see. "Last chance," I whispered to Maria. "When I say go, we run for that service door. Don't stop, don't look back, don't try to help anyone." But Maria was staring at something else now, a figure emerging from behind the blast furnace. This one wore the remains of a paramedic uniform, the same blue shirt and badge we both wore. His face was partially crushed, his left arm hung at an impossible angle, but he was definitely Jimmy Kowalski. "Hey, Maria," he said in a voice like grinding gears. Glad you could make it. The work here is really fulfilling. You never get to clock out." That's when Maria screamed. The sound cut through the mechanical noise like a knife, high and desperate and utterly human in a place that had forgotten what humanity meant. It snapped me out of my horrified fascination, and I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed our portable oxygen tank, a heavy steel cylinder that could serve as both life-saving equipment and makeshift weapon, and swung it at the nearest worker. The impact sent him staggering backward, his pale face showing surprise rather than pain. "Go!" I shouted to Maria. "Now!" We ran. Through the maze of machinery, dodging between conveyor belts and ducking under overhead pipes, we ran toward the distant service door that represented our only hope of escape. Behind us, the workers gave chase, but their movements remained that same mechanical precision rather than the desperate speed of living pursuers. The foreman's laughter echoed through the mill, bouncing off the metal walls and following us like a malevolent spirit. "You can't leave," he called out. "The mill needs you." The work must continue. We reached the service door and tumbled through it into the cold pre-dawn air, gasping and shaking as adrenaline flooded our systems. The normal world, the world of quiet streets and sleeping houses, seemed impossibly bright and clean after the industrial nightmare we'd just escaped. "The people," Maria gasped, her hands shaking as she tried to key her radio. "We have to help them. We have to call for backup." But when we turned to look back at the mill, the service door was gone. In its place was solid brick wall, weathered and stained with decades of rust and neglect. The sounds of machinery had stopped, leaving only the normal silence of an abandoned building. "That's impossible," Maria whispered. "We just came through there. There was a door." I played my flashlight beam across the wall, searching for any sign of the entrance we'd used. Nothing. Just brick and mortar and a few old posters warning about safety regulations that no one would ever need to follow again. We called it in anyway, reported multiple casualties, possible industrial accident, requested immediate response from fire rescue and law enforcement. But when the backup units arrived 20 minutes later, they found only an empty building that had been thoroughly searched by the city's safety inspectors just 3 months earlier. No machinery, no power, no people, and definitely no service door on the east wall. The official report listed our call as a false alarm, possibly triggered by stress and the disorienting effects of exploring a large, dark building. Maria and I were both given mandatory psychological evaluations and 3 days of administrative leave. But I know what we saw. I know what we heard. And I know that somewhere in that mill people are still calling for help on a conveyor belt that carries them towards something worse than death. Maria transferred to day shift after that night. She said she couldn't handle the uncertainty of what might be lurking in the darkness. What calls might take us to places that shouldn't exist. I don't blame her. I thought about transferring too, but someone has to work the night shift. Someone has to be ready when the calls come in from places that exist only in the spaces between reality and nightmare. 6 months later, we got another call. Industrial accident at an abandoned textile mill across town. Maria's replacement, a young guy named Davis who transferred from Pittsburgh, was eager to respond. "Probably just homeless people using the building for shelter," he said as we raced through the empty streets. "Maybe started a fire for warmth and someone got burned." I wanted to agree with him. I wanted to believe it would be that simple. But as we pulled up to the old building, I saw the same signs. The cut chain-link fence, the fresh path through the debris, the faint glow of light coming from windows that should have been dark, and somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the rumble of our diesel engine, I could hear the sound of machinery that shouldn't have been running. The mill was calling again, and this time I knew better than to answer.